It's an honor to be here this morning and to be with you, and thank you for coming, finding a place to park. I know that was no small ordeal. I have a story to start with that is a story I like to tell that I've told a million times, so some of you may have heard it, maybe not. Bev probably for sure. When my son Sam was about 14 years old, he's now about to be 28. He came with me on a trip overseas to England. It was a kind of pleasure business trip thing. He was at the time really into punk music, and punk was born in England, and there's a place called Camden Locks in London that is a sort of mecca for all punk people. So going there was no small treat for Sam. Before we left, it kind of occurred to me that in some ways Sam didn't know what I did for work. You know, he, like many kids, knew that I worked, kind of had a general idea of what I did, but had not really seen me work. So I thought this would be a good opportunity for him. So I called the people in England first and said, would that be okay? And they were fine with it. In the morning, I was meeting with a man and his family. In the afternoon, doing a presentation not unlike today. And they were delighted that Sam would come along. And then I broke the news to Sam. And he's like, oh, do I have to? And I said, well, yes, as a matter of fact, you do. So he came with me, and all day I watched his face to see, what's he think of this? You know, does he find it interesting, or is he bored? I really couldn't tell. And this is unusual because Sam is the kind of guy who wears his emotions on his sleeves. You know, usually he's really easy to read, but this day he was poker-faced. I really couldn't tell one way or the other. And at the end of the day, I couldn't stand it any longer. In the cab back to the hotel, I said, so honey, tell me, what do you think about this work I do? And you know what he said? He didn't even blink. It's like he had been waiting for me to ask him the question all day. He said, I can't believe what a scam you've got going. He says, you sit around with people and you drink coffee and you tell them stories you've told us 1,000,000 times, and they actually pay you at the end of the day to do this? And I was ready to launch into something like, you know, well, you don't understand, honey, I have a clinical background. There's more to this than perhaps your naive 14-year-old. You know, I was ready to go there. But the more I thought of it, the more I went, oh my God, he's right. That's exactly what I do. When kids say things like this to you, when they sort of put you in your place like this, you either have to accept it as being true, or you got to find some kind of rationale. And that's what I did. I went out and found a rationale. No point in standing in the truth very long if you can avoid it. But the conclusion I've come to is the reason why Sam had this response, why he felt this way, was because he heard me talking about ordinary, everyday things. Things that to a 14-year-old boy just seemed like they ought to be obvious. But honestly, I believe some of the stuff we most need to hear as professionals are ordinary, everyday things. That sometimes in our efforts to provide people with special supports and services, we miss ordinary, everyday things. And I'd like to share some of those things with you today. And one possibility is you'll leave here today too going, I can't believe what a scam this guy's got going, but you've been to presentations by scam artists before, so it won't be your first or probably last. But maybe you too will come to notice those things that in some ways are right underneath our noses. Now, I have a website, and the address, oops, wrong direction, is www.deimagine.com. And as you heard Tricia say, there's a number of resources there that you might find helpful. Any number of topics we might talk about today where there'll be some additional information there, and as the day goes on, I'll share with you ideas about how to find it. If you forget the website address, but you happen to remember your handouts, the address is on most of the handouts that you have in front of you. Everything there is free except for things that are ordered through other places, just referred to like books, I think, are worth a look, but everything else is free. Handouts are there about any number of topics. You're welcome to download them onto your computer and use them any way you wish. But one of the things that I notice, an ordinary, everyday thing that people need. My work, by the way, I have a self-employed, I call my practice Imagine, after the John Lennon song. And what I do mostly in my work is travel places like here and spend time with people that are struggling in their life. And one manifestation of that struggle is that they exhibit behaviors that other people wish they'd stop exhibiting. Now, my definition of a problem behavior is you do something other people wish you'd stop doing. Now, whether you ought to stop it is another question, because what is one person's problem behavior is somebody else's lifestyle. But most of the people that I meet in my practice are people like the man in Trisha's story who hurt themselves and hurt other people. And the vast majority of people that I meet in my practice are people that have a developmental intellectual disability, though that's not exclusively true, it's mostly true. And so I'll share with you stories from my practice, from my life, that might be useful to you. Hopefully you'll leave at the end of the day unconvinced of my son's nasty accusation. But one of the things that I notice time and time again, wherever I go, where people have problem behaviors, is that they're lonely. And my bet is you know what I'm talking about before I even start talking about it. Because my bet is you know lonely people. I can tell by looking at your faces you know lonely people. I meet people sometimes in my practice who, when they were little boys and girls, were separated from their mothers and fathers' arms in the name of treatment. We used to think it was a good idea, but it never was and never will be a good idea to separate little boys and girls from their mother's arms. When it's not safe for children to live with their biological parents, then we ought to find a place, a home for every child, not a special treatment center. I meet people, they were sent away from home decades ago. They're in the later years of their life, and it's affecting their behavior every day, what happened to them when they were tiny children. I meet people sometimes in my practice who I just spend a little time with. We have a cup of coffee, we talk. I don't see them again for a year, and they remember me like I'm a long-lost friend. I can't remember what I talked about earlier this morning, let alone a year ago, but they remember everything. I know you know what I'm talking about, because I know you know lonely people too. I can tell by looking at your faces you do. I go places sometimes where people grab onto my hand, they shake my hand, and they won't let go of my hand. One man, he came up to me one time, he grabbed onto my hand, he said, "Do you know my girlfriend?" I said, "No, I'm not from around here." He said, "Adrian," and he smiled from ear to ear. In the meantime, a staff person started fussing at him about this. "Let go of Dr. Pitonyak's hand. Let go of his 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 hand." And then she whispered to me after all of this and said, "Please don't give him eye contact. We have him on an extinction program for this." I'm supposed to shake his hand like this. Don't want to make that problem any worse. He said, "Adrian and I are going to be married." I said, "Really? Have you set a date?" And she fussed at him about this too. "You're not going to marry Adrian, for goodness sakes. She doesn't even have the same case manager as you do." Marry Adrian. She's not even on the waiver, for goodness sakes. Realize the amount of interdisciplinary planning that would be necessary for the two of you to get hitched? For goodness sakes. Well, I wasn't there to see him, I was there to see someone else. But I saw him later in the day, and he grabbed right onto my hand, shook my hand, and he would not let go. Do you know my girlfriend? I said, Adrian, and he smiled from ear to ear. He said, Adrian kissed me. And he had this look on his face, oh man, this her hands are too hot to touch look on his face. I got the feeling he had just kissed Adrian. Turns out he hadn't seen his Adrian in over 3 years. I know you know what I'm talking about. It's that person sitting in that wheelchair when you arrive at that elderly care center or whatever it is, who asks you, will you take them home? Who just really wants to talk about those flowers that just got planted in that box out front, and you stop because you're so sweet. You got a million things you got to do today, but you know that little moment in that hallway, whether that person remembers it from an hour from now or not, is a gift to both of you. It's loneliness. I know you know what I'm talking about. I know you know lonely people too. We are social animals. We are driven to connect in ways that are unexpected. Evolutionary biologists believe something quite remarkable happened about 70 or 80,000 years ago. A region of our brain, it's called the pre-frontal cortex, came into being. The prefrontal cortex sits right back behind the eyes. It's really a small region of the brain, about 1/10 of an inch thick layer of brain that allows us to do things we'd not been able to do before, and in fact no other species can do. It allows us to think about thinking, to actually observe ourselves in a thought process and make decisions based on that. It allows us to problem solve, to make a plan for the future and then later execute the plan. It allows us, when we are in a hot place sitting on a log somewhere, to notice that we are hot, that it is the heat that makes us get up and move. We know we are doing it because of the heat. It's the prefrontal cortex that allows us to do that. It's the imaginative brain, the brain that comes to think of or put together things that have never been thought of or put together before. It's really quite an extraordinary achievement in evolutionary terms. And it's thought to have happened about 70 to 80,000 years ago, roughly. But when it happened, it created a dilemma. And the dilemma was our brains, which were already growing quite big. Ours is, among mammals, the largest size brain compared to our overall body size. Whales, for example, have much bigger brains than we do, but they are quite a bit bigger. We have a very large brain, which is really, our brains always developed to help function all the things that need to be functioned in the body, to process information, to make things happen. And when you're as tiny as we are and you got a brain as big as we do, you got to wonder what's that all about. And it turns out it's all about what happened to us when it came time to figuring out how do we survive. Our brain, it looks like cauliflower. You ever seen it? It's kind of all folded over. This is because in evolutionary time it grew pretty rapidly and nature didn't know how to fit it all in the skull, so folded it all over. But when the prefrontal cortex came, you might say it's like a tipping point, straw that breaks the camel's back. The problem was it caused our skulls to get just a little bit bigger, and now it's thought our birth mothers were having trouble getting babies down through the birth canal. There's significant arthritis in the hips and knees of our foremothers from about this period of time. The thought is that the babies' heads were just too big, so nature, God, you might say, made an important decision, better get these babies out before they're done cooking. And that's why when our babies are born into the world, they got these giant heads and these little dangling bodies. A baby's head accounts for about 10% of its total body weight. Compare that to your head and my head, which is about, on average, 2.5% of our total body weight, and you got an idea how big those little heads really are. Body will grow into it. but those heads are big. But at a time when the prefrontal cortex basically was getting laid down, the software for it, you might say, was getting laid down, the preoccupation of our foremothers was cooperative behavior. It was, can I count on you to go gather food while I watch out for the baby? Will you watch out for predators while I watch out for the baby? So increasingly, the whole mindset became, can I trust cooperative behavior? Our foremothers started to look for signals that said, I can trust you to follow through in the long term in raising this baby, and that's why neuroscientists now tell us about 80% of what our brain is up to at any given point in time is thinking about social relationships. If we're not engaged in a specific task that requires a specific kind of attention, or a motor activity, moving our body in a certain way that requires a certain kind of pattern of movement, most of what our brain is up to, the vast majority of what our brain is up to, is thinking about social relationships. You're working on a math problem, and you get one done, and you got a little time between the next one, your brain's default setting is to go to thinking about social behavior. You couldn't stop yourself from doing it if you wanted to. You've been doing it since you woke up this morning, wondering about your kids and getting them off to school. Are they clean? Do they look all right? Did they get enough breakfast? Are they remembering their lunch pails and that $5 for the field trip that's coming? Your teenage daughter said something hateful to you that just stabbed you like a knife. She's like a ninja warrior. She just gets it and hits you in the side before you even know what's happened. She's out the door. You can't even respond. It happened so quickly. She can be so hateful. And then you try to remember you were hateful too when you were a little teenage girl or a little teenage boy, but boy, your daughter, your son, oh, they seem so gifted at it, so much better at it than you imagined you were. She promised you when she got to school she'd text you because she's just learning to drive now. She didn't text you this morning, and you've already called the front office to make sure she got there okay, and they said, don't worry, she's here. Later, you know it's going to happen. Later, she's going to claim that you're not supposed to use your cell phones at school to text messages, as if that ever stopped her before. You're thinking about social relationships. No matter what you do, you can't stop thinking about social relationships. It's what we do. It's the default setting. 80% of what we think about are social connections. You've been doing it since you woke up this morning. You got here, you found a table to sit at people that are part of your pack. What you wore this morning was about fitting in with the pack. Whether you're able to ask a question today or too shy about that, it's about membership in the pack. You saw someone in the room who looks familiar. Gosh, I've seen you somewhere before. Where do I know you from? Gosh, you look so familiar. Maybe you saw me and thought, I wonder if that's the speaker guy. Is that the guy who's speaking today? I think that's the guy who's speaking. I'm not sure. Maybe you saw someone who's cute. And you thought, I wonder if she has a ring or he has a ring on his finger. Maybe I'll make my way over to that coffee table later and check this out. You've been doing it, and you don't even know you're doing it. It's the default setting. We are, in a nutshell, social animals. Ours is a social brain.